Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe my channel. Cages line the square, their occupants. Aliens of all shapes and sizes displayed. Like livestock, a cacophony of voices rang out, vendors shouting over one another to extol the worth of their merchandise. Chains clinked, cries of despair were muffled, and the stench of despair hung heavy in the air. In the farthest corner, barely visible beneath a heavy shadow, sat one of the least marketable slaves in the eyes of her captors. She was of a race almost forgotten, delicate features marked by bioluminescent patterns that shimmered faintly when she was distressed. Her arms, impossibly slender yet strong, were bound in heavy manacles that looked disproportionately large against her frame. Her captors had beaten her into submission long ago, and now she sat still, her head bowed and her glowing patterns dimmed to a dull, sickly hue. No one bid for her, no one even stopped to look at her. Until he came, the man was unremarkable. At first glance, a human in a long coat, his face obscured by the wide brim of his hat. He moved purposefully through the market, his eyes scanning the cages, though his expression betrayed nothing. Humans weren't common in these parts, not since the fragile truce between their kind and the Galactic Alliance had frayed. Yet here he was, walking boldly in a place where he could easily become a target himself. His gaze landed on her. He stopped, his dark eyes met hers, and for the first time in years she felt something other than dread. It wasn't hope, it was too fragile, too unfamiliar, but it was something. The vendor approached, rubbing his hands together. Ah, human, you've got an eye for the rare, eh? This one here, she's exotic, a bit broken, but you won't find another like her cheap too. The man didn't respond immediately. Medley, he crouched down to her level, his movements slow and deliberate, as if approaching a wounded animal. She flinched instinctively, recoiling from him, and he paused, giving her space. What's her price? His voice was low, calm. The vendor chuckled nervously. For you, a bargain, let's say 200 credits. The man stood, reaching into his coat. Without a word, he produced a small pouch and tossed it to the vendor, who caught it with greedy hands. The transaction was swift, almost casual, as if he were buying a tool instead of a life. The vendor handed him the key to her chains. She's all yours, human. Good luck taming her. The man didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer to her, his shadow falling over her. She tensed, expecting the worst, but then she heard the clink of the key in the lock. The manacles around her wrists fell away, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was unbound. She stared at him, her wide, luminous eyes filled with confusion and mistrust. He didn't touch her, didn't force her to move. Instead, he stepped back, giving her space to stand on her own. Can you walk? He asked softly. Her voice, unused for so long, came out as a hoarse whisper. Why? He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Because no one deserves to be in chains. The answer made no sense to her. In her world, chains were as natural as the air she breathed. Freedom was an abstract concept, something she had stopped dreaming of long ago. Yet here was this stranger offering her a choice. Come with me, he said, extending a hand, or stay, it's up to you. The simplicity of his words shook her. No one had ever asked her what she wanted. No one had ever given her a choice. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and took his hand. Her legs wobbled as she stood, muscles weak from confinement. He steadied her, his grip firm but not harsh. She flinched at his touch but didn't pull away. The sensation of his hand was strange, warm and rough, unlike the cold cruelty she had grown used to. The market around them paid no mind to their departure. Slaves came and went, bought and sold like commodities, and no one cared about one more alien taken from the cages. Yet to her, every step felt monumental, as if she were walking on forbidden ground. She didn't know where he was leading her, but the absence of chains made her follow. They wove through narrow alleyways until the cacophony of the market faded. The red dust of the Streets clung to her bare feet and the air grew quieter, heavier. She stumbled, her body too frail to keep up, but he caught her each time without complaint. Finally they reached a small, nondescript ship parked on the outskirts of the settlement. It was old, patched together with mismatched panels, but it looked functional. He paused at the ram, turning to her. "You'll be safe here," he said. She hesitated, staring up at the vessel's safety was a foreign concept. She had no reason to trust him, no reason to believe his words, but the alternative was the market, or worse. She nodded faintly, and he led her inside. The interior of the ship was utilit but clean. There was a small common area with worn seating, a cramped galley, and a cockpit that looked as though it had seen countless repairs. He guided her to a narrow room at the back where a cot and a thin blanket waited. "You can rest here," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. "No one will hurt you." She lingered in the doorway, her glowing patterns flickering weakly. "Why?" she asked again, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me," she said, surprising herself with the boldness of her reply. He studied her for a long moment, as if deciding how much to tell her. "Let's just say I've seen enough suffering to last a lifetime. If I can stop even a little of it, I will." His words were simple, but they carried a weight she couldn't fully understand. She stepped into the room and sat on the edge of the cot, her body sinking into the unfamiliar softness. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. Her captors had stripped her of her name long ago, calling her by a number instead. She hadn't spoken it aloud in years. "I don't remember," she lied. He nodded as if he expected that answer. "Rest. We'll talk more when you're ready." He left her alone, closing the door behind him for the first time in as long as she could remember. She was surrounded by silence. No shouting, no clinking of chains, no sharp pain, just silence she didn't trust. Its sleep came in fits, interrupted by nightmares of the market and the faces of her captors. But each time she woke, she reminded herself of where she was. The ship, the human, the strange, fragile thing he called safety. The days that followed were strange. He gave her food, simple rations that her body struggled to adjust to, and water which she drank greedily. He didn't ask much of her, only that she let him tend to her injuries and tell him if she needed anything. It was unsettling, this kindness without expectation. She watched him from the shadows, trying to piece him together. He was quite methodical in his movements and spent much of his time in the cockpit or tinkering with the ship's engines. When he spoke to her, his voice was always calm, never rising in anger or impatience, but there was something beneath his calm exterior, a sadness that lingered in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening, as the ship drifted in the quiet expanse of space, she found herself in the common area. He was there, seated at a small table, a data pad in his hands. He looked up as she entered, offering a faint smile. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head, sitting across from him. For a while neither of them spoke. The silence was almost companionable, but curiosity nodded at her. "What happened to you?" she asked finally. "Why do you do this?" He set the data pad down, leaning back in his chair. "You don't let up, do you?" She shrugged, her bioluminescent patterns pulsing faintly. "You saved me. I think I have the right to ask," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fair enough." He was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "I used to be a soldier, fought in a war that wasn't mine to fight. Saw too many people, humans, aliens. It didn't matter, torn apart because someone higher up decided their lives didn't matter." She listened intently, sensing the weight of his words. He continued, his voice growing softer. "I got out when I couldn't take it anymore, tried to disappear, but everywhere I go I see the same thing. People suffering because someone with power decides they're less than human, less than alive. I couldn't ignore it anymore." His gaze met hers, and she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression. "That's why I saved you." Because no one deserves to be treated like you were. Her throat tightened and, for a moment, she couldn't find the words to respond. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." He nodded as if that was all he needed to hear. As the days turned to weeks, she began to heal. Her strength returned, and so did her sense of self. She started to remember fragments of her past, a name, a place, a life before the change. She shared these pieces with him, and he listened without judgment. In turn, she learned more about him. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a man who had lost everything: his family, his home, his faith in humanity. Yet somehow he had found the strength to keep going, to help others, even when he had nothing left to give. Together they forged an unlikely bond. He taught her how to navigate the ship, how to defend herself, how to survive in a galaxy that had shown her no mercy, and in return she reminded him of something he thought he had lost long ago: hope. Their journey was far from over. The galaxy was vast and unforgiving, and the shadows of her captors still loomed over them. But for the first time in years she felt something she never thought she'd feel again: freedom. And it was enough. Her newfound freedom, fragile as it was, came with its own challenges. Each passing day on the ship brought her closer to remembering who she had been before. Captivity, fragments of a life, surface, memories of her people, a vibrant world of bioluminescent forests, and a deep connection to her kind. Yet each memory was tinged with sorrow, for she knew that her planet had been raided and her people scattered or enslaved. The human didn't press her for details. He seemed to understand that some wounds took time to heal and some stories were too painful to tell, and instead he focused on teaching her the skills she needed to survive. One day, as she practiced with a knife he'd given her, a simple blade with a worn grip, he watched her from across the cargo hold. She was a quick learner, her movements fluid and precise despite her lingering frailty. "You've done this before," he remarked. She paused, the blade resting in her hand. "We were hunters," she said quietly, "before everything. My people didn't need weapons like this, but we knew how to fight." "Why not weapons?" he asked, curious. She hesitated, then pointed to the glowing patterns on her arms. "These aren't just for show, they let us connect with each other, with the world around us. We didn't need weapons because we could sense danger before it came." His brow furrowed. "Sounds like a gift." "It was," she said, her voice tinged with sadness, "until they used it again against us. The slavers, they learned how to sever the connection. They took away what made us strong." He was silent for a moment, as if weighing her words. Then he stood and approached her, holding out his hand. "Let's see what you can do now." She blinked, confused. "What? Show me what a hunter from your world can do," he said, a faint challenge in his tone. She hesitated, then stepped into a defensive stance. He circled her, his movements deliberate, testing. The sparring began slowly, each of them gauging the other. He moved like a soldier, efficient, disciplined, but she moved like a predator, her instincts sharp despite her years of captivity. The bout ended when she disarmed him with a deft twist, the blade in her hand pressing lightly against his throat. He raised his hands in surrender, a small smile playing on his lips. "Not bad," he said. She lowered the blade, a flicker of pride in her eyes. "You're not bad either." The days turned into weeks, and she grew stronger. With each passing day, she began to venture out of the ship. When they docked at spaceports, her fear of being recaptured slowly giving way to a cautious confidence. He was always close by, watching her back, but he never hovered. He trusted her to find her footing. One day, as they prepared to leave a bustling trade hub, she noticed something strange. A group of figures in dark cloaks lingered near the edge of the docking bay, their eyes fixed on the ship. Her instincts prickled and her patterns flared faintly. "We're being watched," she murmured as they boarded the ship. He followed her gaze, his expression hardening. "Slavers, maybe," she said, her voice tense. "They feel wrong." He didn't ask how she knew. He had learned to trust her instincts. "Strap in," he said, heading for the cockpit. The ship lifted off, smoothly, but as they cleared the atmosphere, an alarm blared. A hostile vessel had locked onto them, its weapons primed. Looks like someone doesn't want us leaving, he muttered, flipping switches and adjusting the controls. She gripped the seat, her patterns pulsing with anxiety. What do we do? Hold on, he said grimly. This is going to get messy. The hostile ship fired and he dove the vessel sharply, the blasts missing them by a hair. She watched as he maneuvered with practice skill, evading the enemy's attacks while plotting a course for the nearest jump point. But the slavers were relentless. A second blast hit their shields, rocking the ship violently. Sparks flew from the console, and she cried out as the lights flickered. We're not going to make it, she shouted. Yes, we will, he said through gritted teeth. Take the turret now. She didn't hesitate, scrambling to the gunner's seat. She strapped herself in and grabbed the controls. The turret swiveled under her command, and she took aim at the pursuing ship. Her first shots missed, but she adjusted quickly, her hunter's instincts kicking in. The next volley struck true, damaging the enemy's engines. The pursuing ship faltered, giving them just enough time to reach the jump point. He punched the controls, and the stars stretched into streaks of light as they entered hyperspace. When they emerged, the ship was eerily quiet, the only sound the hum of the damaged engines. She slumped in her seat, her hands trembling. He appeared moments later, his face pale but determined. You did good, he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, her glowing patterns dim but steady. They'll come after us again, I know, he said, but they won't find us, not if we keep moving. She nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't the frightened, broken slave she had been when he found her. She was stronger now, and she wouldn't go back. Together they set to work repairing the ship. It wasn't easy, but they were a team now, bound by shared survival and a growing trust. For the first time, she began to believe that freedom wasn't just a fleeting illusion. It was something worth fighting for, and she was ready to fight. The ship drifted in the relative safety of empty space, but they both knew it wouldn't last. Their escape had damaged the slavers' vessel, but it wouldn't stop them from long. The network would come for her, and now for him too. As she watched him work tirelessly on the ship's damaged systems, she felt a pang of guilt. You should have left me, she said quietly, her bioluminescent patterns flickering faintly. He paused, glancing at her over his shoulder. What makes you think I could have done that? You're risking everything, she said, lowering her gaze. They'll never stop hunting us. Maybe not, he admitted, returning to his repairs. But I've made my choice. The question is, what choice are you going to make? She didn't answer right away, her mind racing. Her instincts screamed to run, to hide, to survive at all costs. But something had shifted within her since he freed her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting for herself, for her people, and for the fragile bond they built. And she was tired of running. Later, in the quiet of the common room, they sat together. A map of the galaxy glowed faintly between them, holographic lines tracing trade routes, inhabited worlds, and uncharted sectors. There, she said, pointing to a system far from any major trade routes. That's where my people are, or where the slavers took us from there. But some might still be alive. He studied the map, his expression serious. It's deep in slaver territory. If we go there, we'll be walking into their stronghold. I know, she said, meeting his gaze. Her patterns flared with determination. But I can't run anymore if there's even a chance. Some of my people are still alive. I have to try. He leaned back, crossing his arms. Then we'll need a plan, something big enough to take out the slavers and get your people out. She tilted her head, studying him. You're coming with me, of course, he said with a faint smile. You think I'd let you have all the fun for the first time in a long while? She smiled back. The plan was simple in theory, but perilous in execution. They would infiltrate the slavers' base under the guise of a stolen ship, using forged access codes he had acquired from an old contact. Once inside, they'd locate any surviving members of her species and disable the slaver's operations from within. The journey to the slaver stronghold was tense. Every scan, every transmission made her stomach twist with fear, but he was calm and focused, guiding the ship through the dangerous territory like a seasoned navigator. When they finally arrived, the sight of the slaver's base made her breath catch. It was a sprawling facility carved into a massive asteroid surrounded by patrol ships and defense turrets. It looked impenetrable, but they had no choice. The stolen access codes worked and they docked without incident. She kept her glowing patterns dim, wrapping herself in a cloak to conceal her identity. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who belonged there, even as his hand lingered near the blaster on his hip. Inside the base was a hive of activity. Slavers barked orders and captives were herded through dimly lit corridors. It was all too familiar, and she had to fight the urge to flee. Stay close, he murmured, his voice grounding her. They made their way through the base, following the map he downloaded from the ship systems. It led them to a holding area where cages lined the walls. Her heart ached as she saw the faces of her people, their glowing patterns dimmed by despair. Will get them out, he promised, already working on the control panel that would release the locks. The doors hissed open and the captives stared at them in disbelief. She stepped forward, lowering her hood. You're free, she said, her voice trembling. We here to take you home. For a moment there was only silence. Then one by one they stepped out of their cages, their glowing patterns brightening with hope. The escape wasn't quiet. The alarm blared as they led the captives through the corridors, the slavers scrambling to respond. He and she fought side by side, their movements seamless as they took down anyone who stood in their way. In the chaos, she found herself face to face with the slaver who had once held her in chains. He sneered, raising his weapon, but she was faster. Her blade flashed and he fell, his expression frozen in shock. The fight ended when they reached a hangar where the captives boarded the stolen ship. He rigged the slaver's base with explosives, setting a timer as they prepared to leave. Are you sure about this, she asked, as he climbed aboard. Positive, he said, offering her a hand. Let's give them something to remember us by. As their ship sped away, the base exploded in a brilliant flash, sending debris scattering into the void. The journey to her home world was long, but it was filled with a quiet hope. The captives began to heal, their glowing patterns returning to life as they shared their stories and dreams. When they finally arrived, the sight of her world brought tears to her eyes. The forests glowed with bioluminescent light, untouched by the horrors she had endured. Your home, he said as they landed. She turned to him, her patterns shining brightly. You're part of this now, you don't have to leave. He hesitated, then nodded. Maybe it's time I stopped running. Together they stepped into the light of her world, knowing the fight wasn't over, but believing for the first time that they could make a difference. And so the hunter and the soldier became something more, a beacon of hope in a galaxy that desperately needed it. They had found freedom not just for themselves but for others, and they weren't about to stop there. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe my channel.